Welcome to Future Histories. My name is Jan Groß, and it is my great pleasure to welcome Matt Huber in today's episode. Matt is Professor of Geography and the Environment at Syracuse University and author of Climate Change as Class War, Building Socialism on a Warming Planet. I recorded this episode at the Great Transition Conference, where I was invited to take part in a symposium on democratic economic planning. And I want to send my warmest thanks to the organizers of the conference in general, but also to the organizers of the symposium specifically. Thank you, Simon Tremblay-Pepin. I'm sorry if I butcher your name. Very sorry, Simon. I hope it's not that bad. So thank you to Simon and his team, and thank you to the Democratic Planning Research Group at the Research Center on Social Innovation and Transformation at St. Paul University, Ottawa. You'll find links to their work in the show notes, and I want to particularly highlight the work of the Collective Planning for Entropy. You'll find their paper, Democratic Economic Planning, Social Metabolism and the Environment, linked in the show notes as well. Please go and read it. It's unfortunately behind a paywall, I have to admit, but you know the spiel. If you write one of the authors, for example, Simon, I'm quite sure that he'll be happy to send the paper to you. Huge shout outs also to Ref and Guillermo, who presented in the session before the one that I was on. It was a pleasure meeting you all, and it's really inspiring to see that the debate around democratic planning has so many great people from different fields working on it. I'm very much looking forward to everything to come. I recorded 2 episodes during the conference, and 1 or 2 might be in the making with people I met or contacted there as well. The 2 that I already recorded during the conference are the one with Matt Huber that you are about to hear. And the second one is a conversation with Elisa Loncón Antileo, who was the first president of the Constitutional Convention in Chile. And I was really happy to be able to talk to her as well. I recorded both of these episodes at the same day, and it was really interesting for me to have these 2 very different conversations so close to each other. The episode with Elisa will be up next. Before we start today's episode, I want to welcome Johannes, Grishan and Mark as patrons of Future Histories, and I want to thank Fabian and Lucas for their kind donations. And now, please enjoy today's episode with Matt Huber on building socialism, climate change, and class war. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you for having me.
It's a great pleasure. Matt, let's start with an overview of your general argument in Climate Change as Class War. What are the main points that you wanted to bring across?
Well, I start the book by saying that the main problem we have is we're losing the struggle to solve climate change. Emissions keep going up. They reached a record in the year the book was published in 2022. And as long as emissions are going up, we still are losing the struggle. So, what I argue is that the struggle is really a power struggle over a class of people that control our energy system and control it for profit. And that if we want to win the struggle, we're going to have to build a hugely powerful movement to take on those interests. And so what I argue is that the current climate movement as it's constituted is not particularly powerful. It's pretty embedded, I argue, in the kind of what I call the professional class, kind of minority of highly educated populations that work in academia or NGOs, scientists, and what we have is, a pretty significant group of people in these kind of micro political spaces that aren't really able to build a much broader mass politics around climate. And for that, I argued I take a pretty standard sort of Marxist approach that class is really about who controls production. I critique the way in which climate change is often discussed as a problem of individual consumption and consumptive behavior, individual carbon footprints. And I argue that really it's about how we produce energy, how we produce commodities, how we produce food, and the kind of underlying industrial systems that are sort of behind the scenes in production. And so I argue from a standard Marxist perspective, the working class has particular power objectively by being the vast majority of society, by actually doing the work in these systems that can actually, withdraw their labor, go on strike, and actually force a crisis on the elites to pay attention. So that actually, if we could start to construct a more working class climate politics, we could maybe start to think about building a much more powerful movement. So I think about that in two ways. This is just an overview, but that, we need a certain kind of climate program that will appeal to the whole working class, which is, again, the majority of society, people struggling to make ends meet, struggling to pay for rent and utility bills and all the rest. And so if we can, pair climate decarbonization with more increased secure access to people's basic material needs, you could start to build a much broader popular base. So that's sort of the broad strategy. People have, called maybe like a Green New Deal could do something like this that kind of tries to offer big universal public goods under the banner of climate action. But I also argue we need a much more focused strategy in the labor movement and the union movement that is oriented towards transforming these industrial sectors that are at the core of the climate crisis. And in the book, I take a pretty narrow argument that really the core sector that we should be looking at is electricity. Most experts say if we're going to solve climate change, it goes through the electricity sector. We're going to have to clean up the electric sector, then electrify a lot of things that don't currently run on electricity. So I focus on the fact that, the electricity sector happens to be quite, in the United States at least, quite unionized, like a high level of union density, comparatively speaking. And so therefore there's already an organized base in this sector that could be at least, if not, socialists talk about like people get jobs in strategic sectors and try to build a fighting kind of union movement in those sectors. But even if not, like if you're just an ordinary climate activist, you should really be thinking about how to align with and get these unions on board for a kind of climate action, because I think it's kind of socialism 101. If you want to transform a certain system of production, the best, most powerful actors to do that are the workers themselves, who have the knowledge of that sector. They have the skills that they understand materially how it works, but also they have the power because they do the work in that sector. So again, the book kind of narrowly focuses on electricity. I think since I've written it, I've realized that really when we're talking about decarbonization, we're talking about a massive project of rebuilding our infrastructure and totally, changing the material system under which we live. And I think that can appeal to a much broader suite of unions and workers. In the United States, we call them the building trades, the people that would build new transit systems, new housing systems, new electricity systems. All of those workers, pipe fitters, welders, construction workers, those are going to be the people who would really benefit from a kind of big, investment program to solve the climate crisis. Now, the problem is we're not doing that, right? We're not doing this big investment program. So a lot of times those unions don't really see much in it for them when it comes to climate action. In fact, most climate action gets constructed as about shutting down particular industries. So in any event, that's a long answer, but that's kind of an overview of the argument. The book really has three parts. The capitalist class that's responsible for the crisis, that the owners of production, the people that profit off it, the professional class, which is where the climate movement is housed in this kind of minority of society, not particularly powerful, and then a working class kind of strategy for climate that I suggest might have a chance of winning.
And when it comes to winning over the working class for such a project, the core argument, or at least what I saw as one of the main points of the argument that you make, is that you will have to have an attractive offer for the working class. Yeah. So, what I really liked about the way that you framed it is that, and this is something that I would absolutely get behind, is that the essential core of this offer is security. So it's a form of existential security that takes off the burden that of everyday life, the burden of this struggle that is put upon us all. And I absolutely can get behind this. My question would be, you try to differentiate between sectors that need to grow, sectors that need to degrow, and you kind of argue against, for example, the degrowth movement that, at least in the way that you present it, argues for a total degrowth. So could you maybe explain this relationship between the offer on the one side and the question of growth or no growth, or growth in which sector?
Yeah. Yeah, the more I have these debates and talk to degrowth people, the more I realize, and they realize, that we all agree, actually.
Yeah.
That, well, not on everything, but we all agree that we actually want to grow certain parts of the economy and degrow others. And so one of my frustrations is really just the word degrowth. It's not actually what they're talking about. Like they talk about really investing in what they call universal public services, exactly what you just said, giving people material security, guaranteeing people, in our country, we dream of guaranteed healthcare. We dream of housing as a human right. On the climate crisis, there have been organizers in energy and environmental justice that have called that we really should have electricity as a human right. Like these types of, there are some basic needs that working class people struggle to acquire that could be guaranteed and offer more security, as you said. In general, degrowth has really, they take I call it in the book, I think, a territorial or geographical approach to what needs to grow and what needs to degrow, where they say, it's really the global north, the rich countries that need to degrow so that we can allow the poor global south countries to grow. And to me, that takes a conflict, geographical conflict between north and south, which is actually, from my point of view, a class conflict that we need to think about. And, there's extremely poor people in the global north that need to see tremendous growth in their access to food. Hookworm has returned to parts of the South in the United States where they just don't even have basic sanitation. And so these are diseases we thought we eradicated in the early 20th century, and they're returning right now to like places in Mississippi and Alabama. And likewise, in the global South, there are capitalists. There are very, very rich people who live in immense luxury, have tremendous power over resources. So I like to take a class approach that says we need to, yes, there's some sectors we want to grow and degrow, but actually what we want to do is degrow capitalist control over our economy. We want to degrow the capitalist class, and we want to see a lot of growth in expansion and what the working class can expect and the offers you say, because I think what defines capitalism for a lot of working class people is just insecurity, stress, anxiety about meeting basic needs. And I've used this quote a lot. It really, I think, hit the nail on the head when in France you had the Yellow Vest movement chanting in the streets that politicians care about the end of the world, but we're trying to get to the end of the month. Like the inability of climate politics to really address those end of month struggles. And again, I think degrowth advocates that do strongly talk about offering universal public services, that's a good point of agreement, I would say.
I mean, just as a note, I recently saw a tweet by Jason Hickel on Twitter where he very, very explicitly argued for joining like the degrowth movement and the class struggle movement. And yes. When reading through the thread, I thought like, okay, well, there's not that much disagreement between what you describe in your book and what Jason Hickel was trying to argue for in this thread. And this might be a development that has taken place over a certain period of time in the last years. Maybe there had been more folk politic Greek-ish, Greek growth elements dominating the movement before, but I think this is heavily changing, actually. I'm right now in the process of co-editing a volume on democratic economic planning together with Christoph Sorg, and there's Matthias Schmelzer, Elena Hofferberth, and Cédric Durand together writing a chapter which will address democratic planning in connection to degrowth. So I think these things are kind of coming together.
Yeah, and I've actually brought this up before, where Jason Hickel's sometimes defined degrowth as a democratic planned reduction of material throughput in the global north, or something like that. But to me, those three words, democratic planned reduction, to me really raise some serious questions.
Oh, let's absolutely get into that, because I'm interested in the questions that this
to me, if you're already saying there's a reduction, you're actually foreclosing the democratic part, because I think the democratic part is, for socialists, the most important part, which is that we democratically debate over, we call socialism production for social need. So the question of the question of what we need collectively as a society, and what is enough for a good life, and what types of sectors we do want to expand, and this all has, this is up to democratic deliberation, and whether or not we would want to reduce the amount of material and energy use in that planned democratic, like, that shouldn't already be determined. Again, like, there's a lot of poverty around the world, and we very much, if we were, my socialist perspective is this idea that capitalism actually limits us incredibly in what we can produce and what we can do for people, because it only allows us to produce what's profitable for investors. So if we were actually coming to a place where we had democratic planning over production, and we're going to already say, well, we have to reduce how much material and energy use we use, and that doesn't seem particularly democratic. And to me, it's a real challenge. Again, I'll go back to this north-south thing. Like, a lot of the problem of poverty in the global south, but also, as I'd say again, in the global north, is not really a matter of just taking some energy consumption up in the north and bringing it down to the south and transferring it, right? It's about a fundamental lack of infrastructure. And so there are close to 1 billion people around the planet that have no access to electricity. And the World Bank thinks we'll just give each little hut a solar panel and a battery and call it done. But no, I think, again, if we're a socialist, we would want to build an actually viable electricity grid all over the world. People deserve the type of electricity that we just take for granted, right? And people need modern sanitation infrastructure, like sewage treatment, like plumbing, like these types of things. And again, you don't take that from the north. You have to build the infrastructure in the first place. And like I said before, it's there's some fundamental infrastructure problems even in a rich country like the United States and in the South, where people don't have sanitation. The problem of climate change is we have to just build an entirely new grid system. So it's not like you can just take from this pre-existing material and energy use. So again, I do think, oddly, it's capitalism that limits us. And if we were to take control over production, we would want to be free to decide collectively how much we need to grow, or how much we need to degrow certain things, and all those sorts of things. So.
Okay, a lot of questions coming up there. The first one would be, to a certain degree, in the way that you framed it right now, and I think to a higher degree, even though in the book, I'd say that the way that you use a certain idea of progress as a goal, as a universal goal, I'd say, isn't that in the same way as you rightly point out the predetermined closure of the democratic process? If you say we need shrinking, isn't that kind of equally predetermining a certain idea of how in this case, Western ideas of progress are situated as something to be wanted for other areas of the world. And because this would be equally problematic, because I like the point about, okay, we shouldn't predetermine the question of shrinking or not shrinking, but this would equally apply in this case. No?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I shouldn't assume that much of the impoverished millions around the world would vote or would collectively decide to build, modern electricity and sanitation systems. But I would wager that those populations would love to have the kind of development that, again, we take for granted. And most people around the world today are not isolated from modern infrastructure systems. They have connections to what it looks like and what it can offer to populations. So I think it's also very problematic to kind of assume that like rural poor people in the global south want to sort of remain sort of in this sort of like somewhat romantic idea of being in touch with the land and living in communal harmony. I think most people would love to have more secure access to electricity, modern sanitation systems. But that's just a guess. You would want there to be robust political, democratic, systems that could, again, collectively decide what kind of life and what kind of infrastructure people think are required to actually get rid of this type of poverty and deprivation that exists. So.
Because I would argue, I mean, obviously there's a large span between, the idealization of like in touch with nature, communal life-ish ideas, and the like highly modernist progressivism, like on the other end of the scale, so to speak. So there's a huge range between those, I'd say. Yeah. And I think it kind of also brings us to a question that I had when engaging with your work, and that is, you already mentioned that you think that the predetermined limit would be a way of undercutting the democratic process, so to speak. And then, I mean, immediately the other question pops up, whether or not there are certain like metabolic limits that need to be taken into account. I would guess you'd agree that there are. Yeah. And then the question would be how to incorporate this into the process without predetermining what should be done and what should not be done. And I think a certain area within your proposal made this pop up again and again, and that was this question of like unlimited energy supply, because you put this as a possibility equal to universal basic services in other areas of life for housing, stuff like that. But in terms of housing, for example, universal basic services wouldn't mean that we have unlimited housing. It would mean that we have like adequately comfortable housing for everybody as a right, but not unlimited. So in an equal sense, if you argue for unlimited energy supply, this would also kind of hit the wall at some point when it comes to the question of limits of metabolism. Metabolism. So how do you bring these two together?
So first thing, I think again, a democratic collective sort of planning would have to take into account the ecological constraints or limits under which we live. And so you would hope, again, that democratic planning process would be informed by robust science that is sort of trying to ascertain, what actually we can take from nature without destroying it, right? And again, I just would point out that we live in a world today where scientific understanding of limits informing production just does not happen at all, because production is organized for profit and very short-term profits, and so there's very little of that going on today. So I do think degrowth people and environmentalists generally take a pretty sort of rigid vision of limits, where they, like there's been this science that's come out on like these planetary boundaries that are, oftentimes people represent them as these entirely fixed, static things. But, there's a lot of debate on the nature of these limits and these boundaries. And one thing you can say about capitalism is that there have been serious limits, metabolic limits, that because of capitalism's relentless kind of technological change have just been, shot through. I studied nitrogen, and there was a lot of people worried about the limits of nitrogen and soil fertility in the late 19th century, and then we came up with Haber-Bosch, and it's completely not an issue anymore. So again, a more, and you can call it progressivist or whatever, but a more sort of classical socialist perspective is that, first of all, capitalism limits us incredibly, again, but also that that limits are not fixed or static, that they can be superseded through technical, to say it in the most crude way, developing the productive forces to come up with new ways of producing things. So let's look at the question of energy, which I think you're right is fundamentally limited, particularly when you look at our energy system now, that's still to this day, and again, we're losing the climate struggle because for about the last 20 years, the global share of energy in fossil fuels has remained static. It's about 80%, right? And 80% of that means 80% of our global primary energy consumption comes from a limited resource, right? There's a finite amount of fossil fuels, and that is a really serious limit to any kind of civilization that wants to base their energy on that source. But there are other sources of energy that have debatable limits. And, some have argued that if you want to take a pro-renewables perspective, like the amount of sun and wind that is harnessable on the earth on any given day is about, many times over the level of global energy demand at all times. So when you look at renewables, there's this kind of abundance that could be harnessed in particular ways. There are other, again, technical options that, people dream of nuclear fusion power, which would create a kind of inexhaustible energy. So I don't want to be the person that say, oh, we have limitless energy. No, I think it's contextual, right? And right now, we're in a big pickle, we're in a big problem because we are rooted in an energy regime that is limited, fossil fuels, but we could, I think, again, I'm pretty optimistic that with social control over the means of production, we could shift towards a more flexible energy regime that could provision everyone's needs at a comfortable level. Now, the other thing you brought up is, and again, this is a good example I've been using lately about why context matters. We are in Quebec right now, right? And I have a friend who lived in Quebec, I believe in Montreal, and she joked to me, and she studied electricity. She wrote an incredible book. I met her. I should name her. Her name is Gretchen Bakke. She wrote a book called The Grid, which is really, I learned so much about electricity. And she joked to me once that here in Quebec, and if I'm right, she lived in Montreal for a while. Here in Quebec, they have so much cheap hydro, so much cheap hydro power that Hydro-Quebec, that everyone just has like totally inefficient space heaters in their homes, like these baseboard electric resistance heaters, and they just crank it up, and it's cold here. They just crank it up because it's just, they have so much energy. It's just abundant energy, and hydro has a lot of land use problems and some emissions associated with it, but it's also seen as somewhat clean and carbon free. So people have this sort of abundant, clean energy, and they're just, it feels like limitless in that context, and it's not having a huge impact on climate change, that people are just like churning this electric heat but then I was in Germany actually this fall, and I talked to a friend who kind of gave a different example. If you have like the DDR in East Germany that actually was taking this, somewhat heavy-handed state socialist investment in much more efficient forms of living, like collective housing and public transit, and, you know, environmentalists would all be supportive of this kind of much more low energy use, compact cities, compact living. But, and so they had a much more like, not like these Quebec people, like, you know, just inefficiently wasting energy. But because the DDR was basically hooked up to a grid powered by coal, dirty coal, that the environmental impact of that more efficient way of living was way worse than this just like excessive, wasteful Quebec energy use. So again, the context really matters. You know, when you have clean, abundant energy, you can have much more freedom to do whatever you want. When you have dirty, even if it's dirty, abundant energy, and you're trying to use it efficiently, you can still have a horrible impact on the environment. So,
Let's maybe dig a little bit deeper into this consumption side of things, because I think you make a very good point when pointing out that it's not about individualized guilt. So that's a technique of power, maybe, so to speak, that is being deployed upon us by basically by the capitalist class in all types of ways, in order maybe to distract from what should happen, which is questioning the ownership of means of production, as you rightly point out. So I think you make a very fair point when it comes to that, and you can talk about that as well. But I would like to attach something to this point that you're making there. While you're rightly pointing out that this individualized guilt is not the way to go, I'm asking myself if it's the right way to go to stick to what is, from a critical perspective, being called a consumerist society. And I get the point that you're saying, okay, for a whole bunch of people, they are absolutely not in the position where one could rightly point towards less consumption, because they are simply poor and need a higher living standard. But still, there's this element of a certain type of consumerist culture that is also part of a certain type of fetish that we are being fed for means of profiting. So I think a simple linear continuation of this consumerist mindset is equally not the way to go. And maybe you could steer us through this these areas.
Yeah. For some reason, my argument sometimes gets interpreted as, because we're not, criticizing consumption, we want to just maintain and keep American style mass consumption as it is, and then seize production, right, so that we can just extend American style consumption to the whole world, which would not be a very socialist perspective, because again, I would argue that American-style consumption is, and I talk about this in the book, where I call it privatized provisioning. It's a highly inefficient, privatized mode of living, where you have people spread about and reliance upon, single-family private housing and private automobiles. And this is not a rational use of resources from a socialist planning perspective, in my view. And that a socialist perspective would obviously want to collectivize consumption in all these ways that would bring people together, and collective housing. And you mentioned you live in Vienna and collective housing. So this is something I think is inspiring. And I think the Green New Deal vision, when, it was very sort of ascendant in the United States, with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others, it was this sort of vision of public luxury. So This is kind of like, I think, a socialist vision is, again, more sort of actually changing the conversation over what is the good life, over what do we need as a society, and restructuring not just production, but all of society. So again, production for social need is not just about production, it's about what we need on the consumption side. And that said, again, there are parts of the American way of life, like secure electricity access, modern food refrigeration type services, sanitation, plumbing. Like, these are things I think that everyone, if they should have.
I mean, maybe just a quick question. Yeah. Coming from the degrowth perspective, I mean, one big point is when it comes to what you sometimes seem to slightly hint towards when it comes to technical fixes and how far they might reach. And you pointed towards how much energy wind and solar might potentially produce, stuff like that. From a degrowth perspective, the argument which would then be brought is this question of decoupling, I think, that so it might be that there is so much sun energy coming onto the earth, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we can produce mechanisms for the collection of this energy in a way that leads to a point where you will have the decoupling of growth and raising destruction of the earth, so to speak.
Yeah,
so
right.
Whether or not this is possible, it's actually a crucial point when it comes to this question of where to imagine and negotiate limits, let's say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and unfortunately, I think the decoupling conversation is always sort of in relationship to GDP growth, which is, again, a kind of statistical construction of a capitalist economy as growing as healthy, but to me obscures that it's really about capitalists profiting and investing that leads to GDP growth. So it's sort of a proxy measure of whether or not capitalists are investing, hiring people, and accumulating capital, and that's kind of what really drives a capitalist society. And so, again, we would not want a socialist society to be basically measured by GDP growth. So the question of whether or not you can decouple from GDP growth is not particularly important from a socialist perspective. The question is, again, can we provide for social needs without destroying the ecological conditions? And I think again, I'm pretty optimistic that we could. And there's lots of examples of how, again, that case of big, cheap, abundant hydro providing for tremendous amounts of energy consumption without the same kinds of impacts you would have if you were to be channeling a coal-based form of consumption on that. So again, it really matters.
I mean, but one element of your argument is that there's not hydro energy everywhere equally.
That's right,
so then the follow-up question would be, I mean, in the case of solar, for example, there are certain elements that go into the production of these panels and stuff like that. And all these things are not abundant in a way that will be able to collect all of the energy for quadrupled energy consumption of the earth. So there is a relation that goes beyond the question of GDP growth, but relates to the question of whether or not the production of energy has follow-up environmental costs, not monetary costs, but environmental costs that need to be taken into account when thinking about how abundant the use of energy can at the end be.
Yeah. I'm actually very not as optimistic about renewable solar and wind energy as I suggested before for a whole lot of other reasons. But one thing I can say that's good about them is, with fossil fuels, you dig up this stuff from the earth and you burn it and it's gone. It's like this combustion-based energy system. But with these minerals you speak of, and they're significant, you do dig them up, you put them into these panels or the turbines, and these systems work for decades. So there is a different type of material flow that goes into these renewable systems than goes into the fossil fuel economy. That needs to be stated clearly. But you're right. I'm more concerned, honestly, about the land use that it takes for these resources. It takes tremendous. One good thing about fossil fuel is you dig deep into the earth to get it. You don't take up a whole lot of territory or land to get that energy, incredible energy. Energy scholars call it power density, how much power you're generating per like square meter of territory. And fossil fuels are pretty good for giving you tremendous energy with not using much land. And so to just think we're just going to like basically like, there's just been a recent estimate that to get to net zero, the United States has to put solar panels on the territory that would equal like several states combined, wind turbines over several, like we're talking about huge, to act like we can just like do that, like it's some like Sim City where we're just like plopping things down on tremendous territory. Like that's a huge concern. But again, I feel like this idea that we can decide ahead of time, like what these particular material constraints are, is ahistorical and not in line with what we know how history has shown, which is when there are limits to some certain resource, there are technical changes that vastly expand those limits and often just sort of shoot through them. So if there's a particular mineral that is becoming scarce for the energy economy, there could be a way to find a different one. And if those, again, I think the more serious question is if the extraction of those minerals are starting to really destroy the kind of more broader ecological systems that we rely on to survive, like water systems and, basically, even let's talk about biodiversity conservation, like then you can start to talk about, scaling back that kind of extraction to not, gobble up ecology as a whole. But I think, again, if we had more social control, this kind of planning would have to always be responding dynamically to ecological problems over here and concerns and changing the production system in accordance. And that sometimes this degrowth debate is often about like sort of deciding once and for all if decoupling is possible or not. But again, I think a lot of it's going to be contextual.
Still wondering a bit how much you rely on this idea of possible technical fixes that might come about or might not.
Yeah.
But you kind of pivot to the point of we'll have to see and decide democratically. Huh? So I have two bigger things that I wanted to ask you. Let's start with the science thing, because you kind of hinted towards that area in your last answer as well. I mean, one thing that really comes off as weird for me within the larger climate movement is, and maybe I'm too generalizing here, but anyway, is the like implicit scientism that is carried along oftentimes within the arguments. And I mean the general like listen to the science slogan. It never really worked for me, and I always wondered if it's just a strategic way of trying to use an appeal of authority coming from science, which I would understand for like a youth movement that in the eyes of the broader society is like looked down upon as, but do they know these kids, blah, 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 which is a stupid thing to say. And then to kind of trying to use some of the like societal authority of science in trying to strategically make your point. This is something I would probably understand for a moment, to carry along. But in general, I think it's really problematic to base your movement and your point on this type of appealing to the science in singular, as if, as you said before in one of your answers, as if these things were set into stone through some objective fact. And because that's not the way it goes. It's not science if anybody tells you that it cannot be any different, because that's the essence of science. That these are competing knowledges that fight for the interpretation of things, So I'm just interested in your thoughts about this.
Well, in the book, I argue that it's a very particularly form of class politics on the part of what I call the professional class, or some have talked about the professional managerial class, which for that class, like education, meritocracy, sort of being smart, are kind of like very important kind of self-identity defining kind of aspects of your entire sort of orientation towards the world. So in that sense, I argue that really looking at climate change as a issue of the science and what the science is saying becomes sort of existential to these highly educated people who really take science seriously. And so what I argue is that clearly the people in control of the energy system saw pretty early on in the 1990s that if the science became clearer on climate change, then society might want to do something about it, which would attack their interests. So the fact that the fossil fuel industry started funding these sort of skeptical scientists who would, be uncertain about the reality of climate change was in my view, like a media strategy, a kind of power strategy on the part of the fossil fuel industry. But this kind of offended the kind of professional class climate activists so much that they wanted to focus totally on the fossil fuel industry's role in sowing climate denial, climate uncertainty. And to me, in many ways, sort of made a kind of mountain out of a molehill where, most of what the fossil fuel industry does is, materially invest in fossil fuel energy projects that they want to generate profits off. And they also are spending much more of their time organizing political power. The sort of big climate villains in the U.S. are the Charles and David Koch, the Koch brothers. And they literally set up something called the American Legislative Exchange Council that literally wrote legislation and bills for state level legislatures that they would just send them the bill and then they would pass it. And so they were, donating to campaigns, amassing huge political power. And, on the side, funding some science denial, right? But the liberal climate people are just like, all they want to talk about is the science denial. And they aren't seeing that this isn't really a struggle over facts and science. It's really a struggle over power and political power in particular. And you can point out how dastardly these fossil fuel interests are for denying the science, but that's not necessarily going to give you any more power, right? I think I quoted what's his last name? He wrote a book called Hegemony How To, and he has this great line where he says, right does not equal might. Like being right, being correct scientifically does not equal political might or power. And for this class of people, they kind of sometimes collapse into this sort of liberal worldview where we're just going to debate the ideas and come to a consensus about the truth about climate change, and then we're going to act. And if it weren't for this horrific denial, we would be acting already. But again, even if 100% of Americans believed in the science, that does not guarantee we're going to embark on a process of shifting off of fossil fuels, right? So yeah, again, I think it creates a pretty ineffectual type of politics that isn't really concerned with power. It's about concerned with being smart and being right, which is not going to win.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, we'll get to the class struggle after one last question on how to situate your ideas, because I think that the most difficult element within your argument for me to understand why you stick to it or why you bring it forward was this notion of the good Anthropocene. And the reason why I'm skeptical is that I don't think that it's a good idea to reinstate the human as a sovereign over nature again, because this is an element of modernism, frankly, to be overcome, I think, and that it's a nucleus of the way in which we relate to nature in an extractive logic, because there's a closeness between the two, between the idea of sovereignty over nature and this logic of extractivism. And within this idea of good Anthropocene, to me, it seems as if it's a bit of a weird logic that says, okay, we just need to get into control even more and then use it cleverly, and then everything will work out. But that's not how it works. I think in order to really bring about the change that you argue for, there will need to be a change in position as well on the part of humans. And the change in position would be a change towards a more relational understanding when it comes to nature, instead of this, dichotomy between nature culture and the sovereign, the human as a sovereign that controls nature, even in a good way. I think another element where you point towards is this Marxian notion of the how is it called, bona pater familias or something like that, bonus pater familias. And I mean, come on, this is not the relation we should have towards nature, because it's an hierarchical relation towards nature, and it implies a certain way of subjugation, so to speak.
Yeah, I'm not sure, the good Anthropocene is a phrase from an article by Lee Phillips and Mikhail Rozwerski, and I'm not sure how wedded I am to that frame.
But you do
I cite them, but mostly because they're calling for planning, right? And planning against the market. And so what I would say is that, again, we live in a world today where we just are helpless. We're actually out of control over our relationship to nature, right? We just see the world burning and we act like we can't do anything about it because there's this thing called the economy that just is allowed to just be this naturalized market that just does its thing. And if the market says, like it said in 2022, that fossil fuels are as profitable as they've really ever been, coal right now is experiencing a boom in profits. I mean, how are we allowing that? We're just saying, well, stocks are up. That's what the market says. And we just say we can't control it, right? And so the impulse to plan means we want to take control over our relationship to nature and plan that relationship. Now, I totally hear you. There is longstanding modernist Western problems with the kind of, it goes all the way back to the Bible, this kind of like subjugate nature, control it. I don't have, I'm not wedded to that subjugating vision. I would maybe frame it as one of more focused on stewardship, which I think that Marx quote is really about. Like we want to be stewards of the earth and pass it on to, I think he talks about passing on an earth to generation after generation in a good state. And that, but, I think being good stewards of the natural world, allowing biodiversity to thrive in ways it's not right now, would require planning, right? Would require some sort of control over our economic system. And again, when it's necessary, limiting the economic activity in certain areas so that we can allow nature to thrive. That's why actually, sometimes this sort of perspective that gets associated with eco-modernism or eco, I find somewhat attractive, because they actually say, like, we want things like dense cities where people live in like collective housing and dense public transit. We want this kind of efficient human living so that we can allow nature to thrive elsewhere, like free up land, free up biodiversity elsewhere. And that's why they advocate, they advocate highly efficient industrial agriculture so that the land footprint of agriculture is very small so that there can be more land for nature and wilderness and biodiversity and things like this. So I would take the position that, the more we can plan our economy, the more we can choose collectively, what, again, a broken record, what we need, but also what kind of natural biodiverse world we also want to exist. And, we have, like it or not, humans have consciousness, and we can plan to, we've already shown we can have, nature preserves, we can set aside nature if we want to, right? And so bringing in planning is going to have a certain type of control. Now, while I probably would distance myself from the kind of hyper-modernist sort of domineering subjugation vision. I again am very much a defender of modernism in general. In Marx too, and socialists were really, in Marx's time, like they actually saw what modern industrialization was doing was creating a kind of productive capacity that didn't exist in human history. That prior to the Industrial Revolution, Friedrich Engels would say, like, class and poverty were material necessities because there just wasn't enough production to go around. And 90+% of society lived through agricultural labor, really brutal forms of let's talk about subjugation, brutal forms of slavery, serfdom, and horrific subjugation where tiny minorities were able to live in this kind of luxury. So what capitalism, they argued, what capitalism does is it develops production to such a crazy level that we, for the first time in human history, have the possibility of abolishing poverty and again, really planning and choosing our relationship to nature in a much more conscious and careful way. And also, like, the productive capacity is so high that it at least creates the possibility that we could live in a society where people have way more time than they've ever had. Again, agrarian societies were very labor intensive and people didn't have a lot of time. Our capitalist society, people are always exhausted and stretched thin and not having enough time. So the vision of socialism as one of free time really hinges on, again, this idea from Marx and socialists that industrial production systems have such high capacity that we could actually harness them in ways that free up society as a whole to have free time and more time also for that kind of nitty-gritty collective democratic planning, which takes time, right? So definitely I wouldn't throw out the modernist baby with the domineering, subjugating bathwater, because I do think if you're, in the 19th century or early 20th century, if you were a Marxist or a socialist, you were a modernist. You had this sort of progressive view that capitalism actually creates the material conditions for emancipation of all of humanity. And things are pretty dark right now, but I still kind of fundamentally believe that we live in a world that has that possibility still.
Okay, let's maybe dive a little into the question of how. Mm-hmm. Because we didn't talk too much about that yet, but it's a really, 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 really important question. So, and that's like a strong base of your argument is that many of the movements might have interesting ideas and good values, so to speak, but we need more than that. We need an idea of how to get into positions of power that are able to bring about this change. Yeah. How do we get there?
Well, again, it unfortunately, we've lived in a society where capital has been all powerful for about 5 decades. We've called it neoliberalism. I've often quoted Adolf Reed, the socialist in the United States, often defines neoliberalism as capitalism without a labor opposition. And that's essentially what we had. A really powerful labor, working class movements, labor parties, political parties, and labor unions that built up all this power in the 20th century. And by the 1970s, capital had basically got fed up and they crushed the power of those movements systematically, right? And now we live in a society where capital is all powerful and working class movements are sort of atomized and demobilized and all this stuff. But I come at this from a much, again, a more traditional Marxist view that argues that working class power is not only contingent, it is objective to a capitalist system, that capitalism actually objectively creates this majority that lives an insecure material existence. And in fact, capital requires that sort of production of a proletarianized, insecure population. Otherwise, people would not show up to work. So this sort of disciplining of the market that you have to work to starve really feeds into capital's power as a whole. But it also creates this, huge majority of society that has this material interest in transformation, but that does not guarantee that interest can be organized or that workers are even collectively conscious of that power that they have. And the other part is that workers obviously have power because they do the work, and society depends on them. We found out about this in the pandemic, where we suddenly were talking about these essential workers that society doesn't function unless these workers. And lo and behold, it was the most sort of precarious and seen as like disposable, often immigrant workers that do like the nitty gritty work of reproducing society and service sectors and healthcare sectors and even in the, again, transit and manufacturing, these kind of people that keep society running. But those people have tremendous power just by the fact that if they do go on strike, they can create a crisis and force elites to answer to those demands. I mean, we've seen this recently where in West Virginia in 2018, the teachers went on strike. They shut down the entire state's school system. They created a whole crisis. We've learned in COVID how schools are so important to social reproduction. They shut down social reproduction, and they won their demands in about 2 weeks in a red state. And that's power, right? That's power that workers have. And they didn't just do it by going on strike. They organized with parents and communities to kind of get them on board with this politics that was fundamentally about really investing in education. Like they wanted smaller class sizes. They wanted more classroom space and things like this. In the United States, rail workers threatened to go on strike this past fall, and it led the most powerful people in the administration to basically pull all-nighters to try to prevent this from happening, because they know that I think they're actually terrified of what would happen if these rail workers learned about their power. Like, what if they did shut down the rail system in the height of the holiday season? What would that do to the working class movement? This summer, we might have 350,000 UPS workers go on strike for a good contract. And again, we live in a country where strike activity just fell off a cliff in 1980. Like basically, strike activity was really high in the whole post-war period. It spiked in the 1970s. And then with this kind of neoliberal onslaught, it just fell off a cliff. And so one union leader told Jane McAlevey that strikes are like a muscle. If you don't use it, it kind of atrophies. You forget how to use this power. And so I do think workers, we're going to have to like relearn, reorganize that power. And so anyway, to me, like this leads to that, I think I mentioned before, this kind of two-pronged strategy where in order to, I do think we're probably not gonna win socialism like tomorrow, right? But we can win state power through, again, trying to harness this majoritarian power of the working class as the vast majority of society. In the United States, I use this measure that basically says about 63%. You take out the professionals, the managers, the small business people. It's about 2/3 of society that's really in this sort of broader working class, multiracial working class. And if you can start to construct a majoritarian politics that can appeal to that majority, you can maybe, in a parliamentary democracy, start to win state power. And to me, and people like Andreas Malm have said the same, Christian Parenti, if you think about the scale of the climate crisis and what needs to be done at the speed we need it, it's hard to imagine you achieved all that without state power. The state can not only invest in the new infrastructure, which that's what states often do. They build public infrastructure that society needs, that capital doesn't find profitable to invest in. And but also states can discipline capital. States can actually be can actually take a more confrontational approach toward the fossil fuel industry and start to really aggressively phase out that industry. So we got to win state power. We took a gambit at it with like this Bernie Sanders, and that sort of crested. And so we're back into this real struggle of thinking about how we can build much more powerful movements that could harness state power in way more aggressive ways than the Inflation Reduction Act. Because again, that's what, not to fall back on the science, but the science does say we need radical, rapid transformation of our energy systems. And so we're going to need a much more powerful movement to really channel the state in that way. But again, we also need a more powerful labor movement and union movement, and that's where I see really building up. Again, if it's electricity unions or building trade unions, that's great for the climate crisis. But I think in a general sense, we just need a revived labor movement in general. So if it's teachers going on strike, if it's UPS workers going on strike, if it's grad students who just want a union at my university, yay, grad students, wherever it is, if it's Starbucks workers, wherever we're sort of rebuilding a fighting democratic labor movement that learns that when you collectively organize, you have power and you can force the boss or the capitalist to kind of bend to your demands. Like that's the kind of movement that we need to rebuild. Because again, historically, there's just not a lot of evidence that other movements have been able to really have the kind of results that mass working class parties and unions really had in the 20th century. So for pretty much 50 years, the left has sort of come out of this pretty, we were pretty disillusioned with the ways in which the union movement and labor parties, social democratic parties became kind of internalized into capitalism and kind of de-radicalized in all these ways. So starting around the 70s, people like Andre Gorge were like, farewell to the working class. We're going to build a new kind of socialist politics that would be more like a movement of movements, right? Like many different movements sort of coalescing into one general force that could take on capital. I think we can now say after 50 years that movement of movements is just not really borne much fruit, right? Neither has the labor movement, neither is anything, right? So my position is that, if we're still under capitalism, I believe that there's this more sort of objective, if organized power that the working class has, that we should go back to basics, organize parties, organize unions that fight and build collective power through like real institutions. And again, even if these things aren't done in the name of climate change, if you have a more powerful labor movement, it's shown through history, you're going to have more wealth redistribution. You're going to have higher taxes on the rich. You're going to have much more ambitious programs of public investment on behalf of society, not just for capitalists, right? And that's the kind of orientation towards public sector investment, a redistributive state. These are the kind of systems we actually need to address climate change. So we got to build a kind of more general movement to get those things before I think we can address climate change at the scale we need to.
Wonderful. Matt, there's a last question that I ask all of my guests, and it is, if you think about the future, what makes you joyful?
Joyful. That's a tough one. I mean, okay. So, I was born in 1978. So I feel like my adult, or just my whole life, I've lived through this period of utter defeat for the left and for an utter victory for the capitalist class. So as a historical thinker, I really do firmly believe in my heart that it can't keep being this bad and that history shows that, you can only, subjugate a population in society for so long before they fight back. And so I really do think we're actually seeing green shoots of that fight back right now, actually. Bernie Sanders is one thing. It was kind of this like electoral magic show, like we're going to win socialism through elections somehow. But it's really about organizing power really more in workplaces and communities. And that's what we're starting to see. In 2022, there's a record number of union organizing drives. You've seen like a strike wave in the UK recently. I really do think there's kind of what was it in the UK? They had that campaign, I think that was called like Enough is Enough, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So like I do see like these green shoots of a fighting working class movements that are sort of coming out of the ashes of neoliberalism. So that does bring me joy that we might, for the next several decades, actually be parts of movements that actually have power to erode the power of capital, which has been all powerful for all these decades. So that it does get me very excited and joyful.
Great. Matt, thank you so much for being part of Future Histories.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.
That was our show for today. Thanks a lot for listening. If you want to support Future Histories, you can do so on Patreon. For this, visit patreon.com/futurehistories, or you can simply tell a friend that you liked the show and that he, she, or they might like it as well. Thanks a lot, and hear you in 2 weeks.